From News 8, your local news source, this is breaking news.
I'm Stephanie Zeppelin. Mayor Hogsett and IMPD officials are holding a virtual press conference right now.
By the displays of protest that have filled our streets. Indeed, in recent days, we have watched protest organizers and our police department work together to ensure that these protests are able to be safely conducted. Thanks to this collaboration, our city has been able to hear the words that are not asking for action. They are demanding action. The simple truth is this: we must hear the anguished cries of our Black neighbors who were born into a system where from the moment of birth, they are forced to bear the weight of over 400 years of oppression. They call us to not just see this reality, but to be agents of change. I am listening to those words. To my fellow residents in the city of Indianapolis, I want to say, you should be listening to those words too. For if we aren't listening to what our neighbors are saying on the streets, each and every one of us, then we are failing not just ourselves, but we are failing our neighbors, and we are failing our city as a whole. And if we who have been entrusted with public office are not willing to take that which we have heard and then act, well, the truth is that through inaction, we have become knowing accomplices in crimes of injustice that those who protest seek to abolish, and those of us in office need to change. These problems are massive, tumors of hate that have grown largely unchecked for centuries. But no matter how complicated these times may seem, let there be no confusion. We are confronted in this moment with matters of basic morality, with matters of right and wrong. That is why this afternoon, I want to provide an update on something our community has called for that is the right thing to do: the modernization of our police department's use of force policy. To provide background, we implemented an update to IMPD's use of force policy in 2016, shortly after I took office. Just last week, we also submitted long-needed changes to the department's use of force review board. But it has been clear in listening to those who have spoken out that our use of force policies can and should be improved. So this morning, Chief Randall Taylor submitted a new draft use of force policy to the IMPD General Orders Committee. Here is what it seeks to address. First, we are updating the department's standard for using deadly force. Community leaders and other advocates pointed to a California standard for using deadly force as a national best practice, and we have adopted it wholeheartedly. We are proposing that language as our standard verbatim. Second, we are updating our requirement for identification and warning before deadly force is used to similarly reflect national best practices. Third, While it's long been true that IMPD and its training did not consider the use of chokeholds appropriate in any instance as a technique, and IMPD officers are in fact trained not to use chokeholds, we are explicitly placing that prohibition in the new use of force policy. Fourth, we are providing clearly defined de-escalation requirements. At the recommendation of our Criminal Justice Reform Task Force, IMPD has redoubled efforts to implement de-escalation training for some time. But while there are de-escalation provisions in our existing general orders, they largely have referenced issues related to mental health. We are now placing those de-escalation guidelines explicitly in our use of force policy. Fifth, we are creating a duty to intervene and report whenever another officer uses inappropriate force, which was previously required through other mechanisms, but now will be explicitly included in our new use of force policy. Sixth, these new orders include a clear prohibition on shooting into moving vehicles, and in addition, this policy prohibits shooting from a moving vehicle. Seventh, this new policy requires comprehensive reporting of lethal and non-lethal uses of force. This was already required in existing policy, but has been clearly reiterated in our new policy. Eighth, this new policy clearly specifies rules for using various levels of less lethal force. This change contains principles consistent with the continuum of force principles that are currently being discussed nationally, and we believe will lead to better outcomes for our officers and better outcomes for our community as a whole. A copy of this new draft use of force policy, as presented to the General Orders Committee, will be available to the public for its review. But I also recognize that our ongoing reform of the Use of Force Review Board and the modernization of the use of force policies is not sufficient. That is why this morning I am joined by members of our Civilian Police Merit Board, who I have asked to oversee a full review of IMPD's discipline policy, a policy that falls within that board's legal jurisdiction. This analysis will compare our current progressive discipline matrix to models set forth in other cities, in much the same way that our effort to review our use of force policy produced today's changes. In the coming weeks, and with community engagement, with neighborhoods, with faith leaders, with city county councilors, I have asked our Civilian Police Merit Board to provide recommendations as to what modernizations should be implemented. And I hope they will implement them. And finally, I want to address an issue that has been consistently raised by one specific advocacy group, Faith in Indiana. I have met with Faith in Indiana for many years, and they have been invaluable partners in pushing our administration to make meaningful change. Change for the betterment of police-community relationships, change for the betterment and furtherance of peace on our streets. And that is why I am thankful that their recent engagement has led to our commitment that in the budget that I will submit to the City County Council this August, our office will propose additional funding for the expansion of our group violence intervention strategy that will bring additional staff and resources to bear in an effort to interrupt the cycle of hopelessness, the cycle of violence that has gripped far too many of our young people. Before I turn things over and introduce the chair of our Civilian Police Merit Board, I also want to take a moment to acknowledge something that goes without saying. This is a beginning, not the end. These policies are important, and once implemented, we will have a better city than ever before. But radical social change can never be diminished into an exercise of simply checking a new box or a few boxes and claiming victory. What we confront now as a nation is not a mere problem of outdated policy. We cannot dismantle institutional racism by bureaucracy alone. That's not how it works. That's never been how it works. What we need in America, what we need in Indianapolis, is a process of healing that is not implemented, but lived. Lived by all of us. A personal responsibility to dedicate our daily existence to change that begins within and flows forth in every way we can. Then, and only then, can we begin the process of lifting the yoke off the backs of our Black neighbors and assume the weight of our own obligation to reconcile and to rebuild. I'd like to now ask for comments on behalf of our Citizens Police Complaint Board by introducing its chair, former Supreme Court Justice Frank Sullivan. Justice.
Thank you, Mayor Hogsett. I am Frank Sullivan, the president of the Indianapolis Civilian Police Merit Board. And Mayor, I want to thank you and Chief Taylor for your leadership and your inspiration during these times that challenge us all to search our souls to see what kind of human beings we are and what we can do to make our community better. I'm joined this afternoon by three of my colleagues on the Civilian Police Merit Board, former Deputy Mayor Joseph Slash and former IMPD officers Rick Burkhart and Ron Mills. There are three other members of our board who were unable to join us but are here in spirit. And all seven of us say to you that we accept the assignment that you have laid out in your remarks and look forward to working with you, your administration, and IMPD on a complete review of the disciplinary process, including the disciplinary matrix, and promise you that we will give the matter our most careful and complete and prompt consideration and look forward to implementing improvements in our system. Beyond that, I would simply like to say that police community relations is at the very heart of the mission of the Civilian Police Merit Board. And as this board's president and speaking for all of my colleagues, I want to reaffirm our commitment that our board will fulfill the responsibilities given to it by law so as to assist the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department in serving and protecting our city and its people in a manner that earns and maintains the confidence, the trust, the support, and the assistance of the citizens of our city. Thank you very much. And thanks again to you and Chief Taylor for your leadership.
Thank you, Justice Sullivan, and to all of the members of our Civilian Police Merit Board. And now it is my honor to introduce the Chief of the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department, Randall Taylor. Chief.
Thank you, sir. First of all, I'd just like to say that I am constantly reminded day in and day out of the incredible work that our officers do for the Indianapolis community. Our officers with the IMPD work hard to build bridges within the community. But I also acknowledge that our country is grieving, and I also acknowledge that there are members of our own community that have legitimate issues and distrust of law enforcement. While I can't tell you anything today that will heal decades of wounds, I can assure you of this. Our department as a whole will continue to march toward progress for our community and our citizens. The policy changes that the mayor has announced have been in the works for quite some time. And I am totally supportive of these changes and believe that through these changes, the people of this community will be served in a better way. We are grateful for the peaceful protests and demonstrations that have occurred. We look forward to continued peaceful demonstrations, and we will be committed to being peaceful as the IMPD in response to those peaceful protests. Now I will introduce the Assistant Chief of the Police Department, Chris Bailey, for more about our plan to address this weekend's activities.
Good afternoon. Thanks, Mayor, Chief, Justice Sullivan, Civilian Police Merit Board. First, I want to recognize the many voices in our community that we've heard from over the past several days. We hear you, and we want to work with you to make the change that we know will benefit our community now and in the future. You have our commitment on that. As far as the operations go for this weekend, we want to meet peace with peace. We want to ensure that our neighbors and friends have a safe environment to let their voices be heard. We do not want, nor do we seek, any confrontations with those in our city who are advocating for change. However, we cannot and will not tolerate violence or destruction. We are prepared for those who may come with chaos in mind. But our posture, we want support, and we want partnership, not division. We have seen what can happen when we have mutual respect for one another. Over the past week, we've seen what can happen when we work together for the greater good. I want to thank those in our community who have expressed their frustrations and concerns with peace and change in mind. I also want to thank our officers who have worked countless hours away from their families. They're the committed and professionals we all expect them to be. And you can expect to see that today and every day. Tonight and tomorrow, the mayor has implemented a curfew beginning at 8 p.m. The IMPD will continue to take an education-first approach. We will provide ample warnings before any law enforcement action is taken. Our desire is not to make any curfew arrests. We encourage our community to be home at the 8 p.m. time. However, we understand, appreciate, and will honor all the exceptions to the curfew rule. Additionally, the community can expect some traffic pattern changes both Friday and Saturday night. The time of those we'll be flexible. I will take questions later. Thank you.
Be happy to take questions from those in the press watching.
As always, if you will put your name and outlet in the Q&A box, you will then be called upon for Q&A. Our first person up is Nicole Griffith with RTV6. Nicole, give me just a second. Go ahead, Nicole.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, my question involves the incident that happened on Sunday night with the video that is circulating around with showing the two women getting arrested. I wanted to see where that investigation stands and if you can share any more information on what your message is to the public after that video has been shared around.
Yeah, I'll defer that question to the chief, but I'd like to just make a few preliminary observations. As we outlined last Monday, the chief immediately opened an investigation in the hours after this particular incident to determine whether that interaction was within policy or outside of policy. But beyond that process, I don't think there's anyone that should be able to watch that video and not be moved to emotion. Anytime that our officers deploy force against anyone, that moment is a reminder of the work that we have yet to do to bring peace to our city. That isn't just me saying that. That's how many of our officers that I've spoken to over the last several days feel. But my concerns about these videos aren't as important as the investigation into what happened. And while we await the outcome, I will continue to focus my efforts on ensuring that to the greatest extent possible, we can avoid these types of interactions in the weekend to come. Chief?
So to continue on with what the mayor said, when I was first made aware of that, I did open the internal affairs investigation, and that investigation is still ongoing. I do hope to have some results of that at some point next week. And what we looked at was the conduct of the officers reasonable. Now, I will admit, looking at that video, I had concerns as well. And I can promise that regardless of the outcome of that investigation, we will be looking at a retrain to that type of scenario. I said I'm in agreement. I don't like what I saw, but I don't have all the details yet either. So as those come in, I will make further comments on that and share with the public what decisions have been made.
Sky Aitken, Campus Citizen.
Can you hear me?
We can, Sky.
Okay. So with Chris Bailey saying that we should continue to take an educational approach, have you all ever been in a protest and understood how loud it is and the fact that you cannot hear what the officers are saying when they announce things?
Yeah. Chief, you want to address that?
I understand that and recognize that concern. We have a PA announcement that's also played on the loudspeakers of the Monument Circle, and I'll make sure I pass that message on to all the officers to be as loud and as frequent in those that information as possible. Thank you for that.
Brianna Cooper, Indianapolis Recorder.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Brianne.
Okay, I have 3 questions, 2 for Chief Taylor and 1 for Mayor Hogsett. So Chief Taylor, it seems like the #1 demand from the community is that IMPD release the name of the officer who shot Deshaun Reed. And I understand that there's information you can't release before the prosecutor's report is finished, but I was wondering what the reasoning for not releasing the officer's name is at this time. And secondly, regarding IMPD's confiscation of medical supplies last weekend, given that demonstrators had a reasonable expectation of officers using chemicals, why is it wrong that they had supplies to lessen the effects of it? And finally, Mayor Hogsett, while removing a Confederate monument from Garfield Park is a good gesture and a first step, I was wondering what your plans are for addressing and solving issues relating to systemic racism here in Indianapolis.
So, first question about the releasing of names. I don't think it wise that we do that, honestly, right now, due to threats that have been made to officers. Now, I'm not saying that those names won't be released at some point. They obviously will be. I think the positive thing to look at here is a special prosecutor has now been named, and the hope is that person will be able to review our files, our case files on this, and be able to allow for further information to come out over the next few weeks. Your other question about tear gas and medical things, medical supplies, those are things we are looking at. Some of my concern initially was things that were being projected towards officers, frozen water bottles and the like, those kind of things. So those things concern me. The hope really with tear gas is that it will move people along. If there's a reason for us to deploy it, it usually has something to do with violence or destruction of property or putting officers in danger. So obviously I'm concerned whenever someone has something to try to negate that, in fear that it's going to continue whatever occurred before, whether it was the violence, the destruction, or the placing officers in jeopardy. As we've said before, there were a number of people that came down and demonstrated peacefully. And to those, I'm very grateful. And I believe if that is the decision of a particular group that they're going to be peaceful, then there should be no concern with tear gas in the first place.
Yeah, Brianna, in response to your question about the elimination of systemic racism in the city of Indianapolis, that's obviously what we are here talking about today, and today's announcement and the changes that will be implemented as a result of today's announcement, I think are important first steps, but they are only that. They are first steps. We have, in the last 5 years, attempted to make progress on all fronts, not just in terms of the community relationship with our police department, but also to provide greater educational equity, justice, and fairness throughout all of Indianapolis. A couple of examples is our summer jobs program for our young people, called Project Indy. That, I think, is an important step in giving people opportunity, young people, opportunity over the summer months, and then even throughout the school year for meaningful relationships and employment and mentorships. Indy Achieves, a program that we instituted just last year, which provides Marion County residents greater opportunities and greater access to post-secondary educational opportunities, whether that be in the form of a credential, a certification, a licensure, an apprenticeship, a 2-year college program, or a 4-year college program. I think that is a step in the right direction. And then as a final matter, I simply would reiterate the commitment that we want to make progressive change and the kind of changes that are being demanded by the community. And as a drumbeat for change, you will be hearing even more announcements over the coming days and the coming weeks. It begins right now. It begins here. And I think that if we collectively as a community hear the cries of those who have been subjected for so long to inequity and injustice, that we as a city can move forward into a new day where everyone's rights are protected.
Amelia Pack Harvey, Indy Star.
Hi, can you all hear me?
Yes, Amelia.
Hi. So this is just to clarify. I have a few questions. Is this our first progressive discipline policy and use of force policy that IMPD has ever had? If so, I guess why have we not had those kinds of things sooner? And also, how does that compare then, especially in terms of progressive discipline, with the steps that we currently take to discipline officers? And then my final question, sorry, was, are these changes going to require any kinds of negotiations with the FOP in their upcoming contract?
Okay.
So for policy questions, I'm going to introduce Deputy Chief Kendall Adams to answer your questions.
Good afternoon. On the first question of, is this the first progressive discipline matrix that we had? No, we currently have a matrix in place now. I think what we're going to do over the next several months is review that with the merit board to determine, are there enhancements that we can make to that discipline matrix that makes it fair and equitable and procedurally just for police officers and our community. What was your second question?
The same question, I had the same question in regards to our use of force policy.
Yeah, obviously our use of force policy was in 2016. We updated it then, we're updating it now because we have reviewed that with national experts and local experts to determine additional enhancements to that policy that makes it more in line with best practices. So this is just a iteration of that. Obviously, our use of force policy is governed by the 1989 Graham versus Connor case, United States Supreme Court case, but we've added additional restrictions that makes that policy objectively reasonable. And I think the last question, what was the last question?
In regards to whether these changes require negotiations with the FOP in our upcoming contract.
Well, I think in a good faith effort, we've reached out to the FOP to get their feedback on these policies. We think that's a practice that Chief Taylor has asked us to do in a good faith effort. We'll do that. But they don't require an FOP vote.
Darius Johnson, Fox 59.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Either Mayor or Chief Taylor actually have multiple questions. So is there an exact timeline of when he can start changing in the department or on the streets of the policies and different reviews that you all have for the review board? Can we expect them to have things you all within 90 days? We know other cities have done this with once you change just a certain amount of time. What can we tell people? Also, I've spoke to some throughout the civil rights era who were present and talk about some things that apply today with the eyes, yes ma'am, no sir, because also I'm a Black person, then you are you're still teaching this to their kids today. What do you tell parents this weekend as opposed to last weekend as far as keeping that order downtown?
I will have to, I'll have to concede that you were cutting in and out. We must have a very bad connection. So might try to repeat the question. I believe it was directed at Chief Taylor, but I think it bears, it's worth repeating because we missed large portions of it. Chief?
Okay, hope you can hear me a bit better now. Is that okay?
Let's keep going.
All right. So for Mayor or Chief Taylor, either of you can answer this. Asking, is there an exact timeline of when these policies are under review will now be in effect, and when people can start to see some of this change?
I'm not catching your first part of that at all.
Darius, we're going to have to circle back. It's incredibly hard to hear you. Rich Knight, WTHR.
The last several nights where we had a curfew, protests were allowed to go on past the curfew, well past the curfew. What's the purpose and effectiveness of having a curfew this weekend if it's not going to be enforced? That would seem to just disrupt business and recreation for other citizens.
Well, our response, to be honest with you, is dictated a lot by the demonstrators. So our hope is that if you're going to demonstrate and be peaceful about it, like we've had in a few days, then we may not need to push the curfew issue. That's something that we would hope to use really only if things are getting out of control. And the last groups we've had have been cooperative, so we didn't feel that we needed to do that.
Rick Callahan, Associated Press.
This is Rick. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, I had two questions about the internal investigation involving the 4 officers involved who were captured on the video in that Sunday night's incident. And so they've been reassigned to a support role during that investigation. Can you elaborate on what that involves, such as have they been moved from patrol duties to desk duties? And the second question was, while that incident's still under investigation, including the events that preceded it, would the proposed use of force policy changes that are going to the General Orders Committee, would those place any restrictions or new restrictions on officers' use of batons or pepper balls or other devices against citizens?
Sure. So to the first question, the reassignment means that those officers will not have contact with the public during our investigation. The support role means that, yes, pretty much it's desk duty until that investigation is completed and decisions are made as to what, if any, discipline is going to come out of that. As to the second part, whether the old policy or the new policy, reasonableness is what we're going to be looking at. So yes, there are changes in the new one, but it's not specific to the use of pepper ball or batons. It all follows along, was that a reasonable action for that officer to take in that scenario? And it's like I said before, in this one with the video, if nothing else happens, and I'm not suggesting this is the only thing that will happen, but I think we have to look at a training scenario that looks at what happened there and see if there would be a different response.
Leah Horges, Wish TV.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So, Chief Bailey, you mentioned that you guys are going to take an education approach when being out at these protests tonight. Is it safe to say that at 8 o'clock you guys will follow and observe and allow these protesters to continue to peacefully protest without you all intervening in any way?
Well, like Chief Taylor mentioned, a lot of our response is based on what happens in the area. Right? If we have a peaceful protest, there's no like we've seen the last few nights, even the nights where we had curfew, there's no legitimate reason for us to intervene in that type of a protest just because there's a curfew. Curfew is a tool for law enforcement if it becomes necessary to use, and that's the approach we're going to continue to take.
Jesse Wells, Fox 59.
Yeah, I guess this is for the chief or the mayor. Downtown obviously is not the only place that's seen violence in the city in recent days and weeks. We just had another violent night last night with multiple people shot, including a 16-year-old, one person killed. We're at 86 homicides for the year, which is significantly higher than years past. Any thought on sort of, what we've seen this year and how do we start to reduce some of that, violence heading into the summer months?
Sure. Yeah, those numbers are really high. Obviously, anytime you have a homicide or a murder in the city, it's too many. Why it's so high this year is hard to answer. We've had a number of challenges. Obviously, someone might make an argument that COVID had something to do with it. People are frustrated because they've had to stay inside. You could make the argument that it's just emotional frustration for different things on what's going on in people's lives. As I look back and observe some of those murders we've had a whole gamut. We've had some that I believe are truly drug related. And as we've said before, people who decide to play in that drug game, there's a higher incidence of people being murdered. But some of it is, guy doesn't like someone his girlfriend has talked to, and there's a murder that occurs, or there's something with a Facebook post or something that causes a murder. It's a gamut of things, and because of that, we reach out to the community to try to find those answers, those ways to help people deal with whatever it is that would cause them to pull the trigger. We know that that's never the solution to a problem. It ruins someone else's life, and it ruins the shooter's life as well, because now there's criminal charges that are going to be filed, and you're probably going to be looking over your back until we catch up with you. No need for that. We rely on the faith-based community as well as other groups that are willing to deal with youth and just people in general to try to help find solutions to those things. And if I could, let me clarify something. I said that those officers that were involved with the emergency response group were assigned to desk duty. They are just not assigned to the emergency response group, so they're not dealing with the public in that capacity, but their support may not actually put them on the desk.
Sam Quinn, IBJ.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay.
We can.
Okay, my first question is just following up on curfews from the last couple of days. I know we didn't have one Wednesday and Thursday, but were there any arrests made or was anybody fined for violating the curfews? And then also, I'd like to know, maybe this is best for Mayor Hogsett, but I'm hearing from some business owners and people in the business community that they feel like the curfews are just another thing that is hurting their business following the pandemic. So how long do you think we're going to have to see these? And what do you say to the businesses who are hurting from the result of the curfews?
We did not have a curfew on Wednesday or Thursday, and so there were no violations for curfew. And to my knowledge, there were no arrests associated with any sort of protest downtown the last 2 nights.
Yeah, Sam, I just follow up by saying that we are only imposing curfews when we believe it to be absolutely necessary as a tool to preserve the right to peaceful protest, while at the same time avoiding any kind of violence, vandalism, looting that may ultimately occur. And they will only be used when we make a decision that they are necessary. If we also determine that they are not necessary, as obviously we determined over the last couple of nights, curfews will not be imposed.
Adam Wren, Washington Post.
Yes, I'm just following up on the incident that was caught on videotape. Is there any background information on what specific advocacy group was involved in that particular protest? And have the two people, the two women in the video, been identified? And do you expect at any point to have their names released, or the officers involved to have their names released?
I do not have the names of the women that were involved. I've not heard of a formal complaint by them at this point. As for the officers, those names will not be made known immediately. Again, I'm not saying that may not happen somewhere in the future, but it will not happen before that investigation is complete.
Jill Sheridan, WFYI.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Mayor. Will you be joining the protesters at all?
I didn't hear the whole question. If you could repeat it.
Will you be joining the protesters at all in the coming days?
Well, I certainly have been in contact with many of the protesters. So in a very real sense, I've had interaction over the course of the last week. For example, I personally met with many groups participating in the demonstrations, including Black Lives Matter, the NAACP, the African American Coalition of Indianapolis, the Urban League, and others. And those conversations, frankly, have helped lead to today's important announcement. And I'm committed to continuing to listen and to act. As for the protests themselves, I'm absolutely open to joining them in the coming days in a sign of solidarity. And it would be my hope that in that moment I can continue to listen and then act on their behalf.
Tim Craig, Washington Post.
Hello, my colleague actually just asked two of the questions, but since I have you, is there any clarity in that video that surfaced in terms of what is the department's policy on the use of force with batons? And how readily or freely is the department policy to use batons against protesters? And also, could you just clarify at that time when you believe the video was taken, what may have been occurring before that to result in such a display from the officers?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And those are some of the same questions that we had in terms of that last part of that question. We don't know. Right now, this is an internal investigation and we're trying to determine all of those factors that you just kind of mentioned. One of the things I would mention is you talk about the young lady in the video. We would love to talk to her. If she could come forward and give us a statement, that would be very beneficial in this investigation. The other thing is, how do we look at our uses of force? And as I kind of mentioned earlier, it's objectively reasonable with a number of factors to include whether the person is armed, the mental state of the person, the officers, what weapons and tools they have available. So there are a number, like 10 factors that we look at, and it's taken from what an officer at that time knows, not from the perspective of someone that's not involved. And so I think that's an important element to talk about when we talk about use of force. And that policy will be on our website shortly, so that can be viewed, and it will list out those objectively reasonable parameters that we're kind of mentioning here.
Tom Healy, Indy Midtown Magazine.
Hey there, am I on?
Yeah, Tom.
Hi. Mayor, appreciate the time. Curious, I know the focus is responsibly on downtown, but are you also looking at perhaps other parts of town that where you might be prepared for some flare-ups?
Yeah, Chief.
Yes, sir. We monitor all that all the time. We're all constantly looking at the entire county to see where we need to adjust resources or work with the communities to make sure that we don't have any issues. And that's no different in this case now. We have all of our district commanders are out. We are well staffed and we'll adjust as necessary to deal with any issues that we find anywhere in the county.
Darius Johnson, we're going to see if your mic is working better. We can hear you better this time.
Test 1, 2. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so the first question is for Mayor or Chief Taylor, is there an exact timeline of when people can start to see change in these new updated policies, whether that's in the department or on the streets? I know some cities have basically said they're hoping to see things within 90 days. Also, what do you have to say to the parents who are still teaching their kids how to address police? Yes, ma'am. No, sir. Don't let them in the eyes. And that police are more threatened by you because you're an African American. And what will be different this weekend as opposed to last weekend?
Okay, you're still in and out, but let me see if I can take a run at it. The stance that we're taking this weekend is similar to what we've taken before. Like I said, if things are peaceful, then protesters or demonstrators have no reason to fear the police. Will not be involved with peaceful protest in any kind of way. Our job will then just be to observe and make sure things go peacefully and safely. I think you had something in there about addressing police, people teaching their kids to address police as ma'am or sir or something along that line. This isn't the first time I've heard this about juveniles being concerned about talking to police. We would certainly hope that they would feel comfortable speaking with us. Although I understand that uniform can be intimidating, we want to have those relationships with young people, very young people, high school age people. Those are the people that are going to be running the show later on down the road. So we want them to have a positive experience with law enforcement. We want to be able to talk to them, tell them that we're looking out for them, but we also want them to be able to have an open dialogue with us about their concerns and how we respond to things. I think that's only fair as they go from young people to young adults. And missing the first part of the question, if you could keep that.
Chief, the last question was, what will be different this weekend as opposed to last weekend?
Well, if we go along the lines of what we've had here lately, it'll be very peaceful with no property destruction and no violence. That's what we're looking for. I think the community and people that will come down here are fully capable of doing that. So I would expect over the next few days that it'll be peaceful. People will be able to get their message out. Hopefully they'll understand that we as a department are for them. The question was asked to the mayor earlier about participating in protests. I know I did one in the rear of the city county building with that people were protesting the treatment of George Floyd. Very much agree with that, and it was very peaceful. I think we made some good contacts. So the hope is that as people have these concerns, that we can enter into constructive dialogue with one another on how to make it safe for our officers, but more importantly, how do we make it safe for the community, allow their messages to get through, and make sure that they feel good about the IMPD and the city as a whole.
Russ Dodge, WITT.
Yes, I have two questions here. First one is regarding the curfew, the 8 o'clock time for this weekend versus the 9 o'clock from the previous days. Any reason why you switch back to the earlier hour? We heard that from some restaurants. Does that mean I have to close at 8 o'clock?
Yeah, Russ, the one evening where the 8 o'clock time was expanded to 9 p.m., I believe was driven in no small measure because it was the night before the primary election day, not only here in the city of Indianapolis, but throughout Indiana. And there were some appropriate concerns about precinct and poll workers wanting to go to their voting place to set up for the next day's voting, as well as precinct workers going to and from the city county building and to the warehouse out on the east side of Indianapolis, where some of the absentee ballots were being collected and gathered. So the fact that there was a time change really was driven more as a result of trying to not only implement an important encouragement for people to protest, but then go home at an appropriate time, while at the same time assisting those who were trying to conduct the primary election in a safe and fair way.
And our last question will be from Aaliyah Horges, Wish TV.
This question is for Chief Taylor. The action that the officers conducted in the video on Sunday night, you mentioned that you plan to review that. At what point, that action specifically, what policy does that fall back on that you are trying to change so that will not happen again?
Well, like I said, I always wait as much as I can, at least, to see the outcome of the internal affairs investigation and what that all brought forth. Certainly could be a conduct issue of some sort. The hope is that, like I said before, regardless of whether it's in violation of anything, I think it'd be prudent to us to retrain in that particular scenario to make sure those things don't happen again. That would be my goal. But at some point when that internal investigation is complete, that's when I'll make my determination on, again, what, if any, discipline and what exactly we need to do. Like I said, I'm in agreement. I didn't like the way that looked. I think most of my staff, all of my staff, is in agreement there. So we're going to have to look at doing something with that to make sure that we don't ever see that again.
All right, this has been a news conference from Indianapolis Mayor Joe Hogsett, IMPD officials and members of the Civilian Police Review Board talking about new reforms they plan on instating and that they'll have more in the coming days and weeks, including enhanced progressive discipline for officers, banning chokeholds, and requirements that they'll have to follow before using deadly force. We're going to have more of that information tonight on our newscasts. We'll also be standing by for the governor's news conference on COVID-19.